one another.
Welcome back, everyone. I'll encourage you to grab your seat. Welcome back, everyone attending in person and those of you who are joining us virtually. I would like to welcome the panelists, all of whom will be joining us virtually for our next session, Trust Building in Asia in an Era of Great Power Competition, moderated by Senator Pa Wu. I'll turn it over to Senator Wu to kick us off. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and I'm hoping that the sound is coming through all right. I'm speaking to you from Ottawa, the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe Algonquin peoples, but rather wishing I was with you in the traditional territories of the Lekwungen peoples. We're very fortunate that we can do this panel all virtually, and I want to tell all of you that we're doing this across 4 time zones, including for 2 of our panelists, time differences that are really quite unbearable. I'm assuming Dr. Sunami is in Japan, and it's in the middle of the morning right now. And for Dr. Jackson, it's also very early indeed. It's my great pleasure to be the moderator of this panel. I want to thank University of Victoria and the organizers of the Victoria Forum for putting on this session, to the Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada for conceptualizing it and bringing together this set of speakers. Over the past few days, we've been talking about trust deficits across a variety of domains, from the local to the regional to the global, and also discussing the ways in which we can overcome some of these deficits, looking both at individual actions as well as collective actions. In the course of the discussions, there have been occasional references to the impact of geopolitics in exacerbating or causing the trust deficits and the resultant inequalities and divides that we see in the world today. We heard this in the panel discussing health issues. We were provided some stark examples of how nationalistic and geopolitical priorities have made the task of fighting COVID more difficult through vaccine nationalism and the refusal to allow for more generous IP waiver for the manufacturing of vaccines. We've heard how geopolitics is affecting the flow of information and the growing distrust of information that flows across our different societies, and a variety of other domains where the specter of geopolitical conflict has been a factor. But we haven't really had a focused discussion on this issue. And what we're going to do today is have a little bit of that by looking at the ways in which geopolitical tension, more specifically great power competition, manifests itself in the Asia-Pacific, or what some people prefer to call the Indo-Pacific region. There are many different varieties of geopolitical conflict and their manifestations across the Asia-Pacific / Indo-Pacific region, and I'll leave our panelists to talk about the areas that they see to be of most concern. But the reason why Asia is the arena for these tensions and why we should be concerned about what's going on with geopolitical tension in Asia is because Asia is where a lot is happening. It's the region which has been growing the fastest for many decades now. It's widely believed that the economic center of gravity, if not the political center of gravity, is slowly shifting towards Asia. And it is, of course, the place where an enormous amount of technological innovation and scientific progress is being made. No surprise, therefore, that geopolitical tension and competition should find a focus in that part of the world. We're going to have a discussion on the sources and causes of the tensions that we see. We're going to talk about what some of the remedies might be. I'll do this by asking some questions to our panelists. We'll try and go 2 rounds, and then I'll open up for some Q&A from the audience. So let's get right to the questions. And I want to, first of all, pose this set of questions to all 3 of the panelists, which is to ask if they can tell us what they think are the major reasons for growing distrust and political tension in the Asia-Pacific region, and where or what they see are the hot spots of greatest concern. I'm going to ask first that Kristi Govella start, followed by Van Jackson and Atsushi Sunami. And since you all have all their bios, let me just quickly say that Ms. Govella is the Deputy Director for Asia at the German Marshall Foundation. Van Jackson is a Senior Lecturer at the Victoria University of Wellington, also a Distinguished Fellow at the Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada. And Atsushi Sunami is the President and CEO of the Sasakawa Peace Foundation. Kristi, over to you.
Thank you so much, Senator Wu, and thanks to the organizers for having me here virtually today. So your question is a very broad one, but I think obviously when we talk about the Indo-Pacific, the rise of China is something that always comes up, and it's really had broad impacts across the region. And, you know, we see that it has prompted concerns on the part of many countries, though not uniformly. So if we think about distrust and tension, to speak to your question, those have certainly intensified in the realm of security. And we hear a lot about geographic hotspots like the Taiwan Strait or the South China Sea. I'm guessing that one of my fellow panelists may say more about these kinds of security issues. But in my brief opening comments, I just like to focus on the fact that this distrust and tension have also expanded to firmly include the world of economics, ranging from trade to investment, aid, and innovation. So that's something I think that has really shifted over the last several years and profoundly affects the dynamics of trust building and of tension in the region. So while we used to talk about, you know, something called hot economics and cold politics, which was this idea that, you know, economic relations in Asia were healthy and positive and could be a source of connection building, that's really changed dramatically. And we've seen this because of things like increasing use of economic coercion, which has really highlighted the vulnerabilities of interdependence. And this has been pronounced in the case of countries, for example, who've been penalized economically by China for their political decisions. So this is a way that economics and security have been linked, and therefore dynamics cross over between these different realms. But more broadly, I would say that the trend towards populism and protectionism in many countries and a general weakening in the support for free trade has really undermined the regional and economic trade system and disrupted a lot of the momentum towards liberalization. And so when we think about this in the context of trust, it means that economic ties are no longer this source of positive momentum or a method of building trust and relations as they once were considered to be. So instead, it's an area where countries have much weaker trust in one another to make or keep their commitments. And there is weaker trust in the system overall to maintain order and accountability. So, you know, at the moment, economics are not as much of a hotspot as they were during the Trump administration when we were really talking about the, you know, return of trade war. But in fact, many of those policies, like the tariffs on China, are still in place, if not being actively discussed. So I think that economics is definitely a realm of ambivalence for many countries and something to be watched. So that's an area that I do a lot of research on, and it's one I'll highlight to start. But I think it is striking how we see these, you know, dynamics not only in security and politics, but in economics and across a whole range of other issues in the Indo-Pacific today.
Thanks, Kristi. I'd like to come back to you later on what is it about the rise of China, the rise of any emerging superpower that should cause geopolitical tension? Why can't a nation rise in significance economically and politically? And also to perhaps get you to elaborate a little bit on whether, in fact, whether all the countries in the region, particularly in East Asia, accept that the economic ties, the interdependence of economies is something they're willing to truly sacrifice at the altar of political security matters. Over to you, Van Jackson, for your views.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me on the panel. So there's a way in which growing mistrust in Asia can be understood as being downstream of shifting balances of power and competitions for influence, and by some claims, competitions for hegemony. But the balance of power problem is downstream of regional and global political economy, which is to say, I think mistrust is a symptom, not a root cause of deeper political dysfunctions and trends. So everybody knows Asia has a series of security dilemmas, right? Territorial disputes. They're managed by, regional pragmatism and a willingness of states to do what Kristi said, right? Hot economics, prioritize economic development historically, right? And at least appear as like friendly sovereign equals. But the Asian relative peace that has resulted from that pragmatism the past 40 years or so, like it's been precarious. It's been contingent on national governments being able to alleviate poverty, make good on the economic wager, right? Increase living standards over time. If we're being honest, the ability of elites and kleptocrats to get paid taking advantage of loopholes in the global economic order. And this is not a sustainable recipe for regional stability or regional order, right? And heightened mistrust, the trust deficit, is a sign that we're starting to pay a price for this, I think. So how? Okay, economic growth papers over extreme concentrations of wealth and political corruption. But of course, like there's no such thing as limitless growth, man. So if you have a bunch of political regimes, and I would include the US in this, that are generating wealth, but keeping their mass of workers economically insecure, well, then how do you think those regimes are going to stay in power? And that's the danger. So like Martin Luther King said, the Southern aristocracy took the world and gave the poor white man Jim Crow. And there's a version of that that is Asia's basic problem. Like reactionary political regimes need forms of ethno-nationalism and jingoism to preserve systems of entrenched privilege and extreme wealth hoarding. Like ethno-nationalism and oligarchy, they end up going together like peanut butter and jelly, and that matters because geopolitical rivalry gets activated by the antagonistic politics that comes with an exploitative, unequal, precarity-inducing political economy. So competitions for influence, the military balance of power, that is a context that heightens mistrust among nations, for sure, right? And therefore, we should want to like minimize it or avoid getting caught up in strategic rivalry if that's possible. But the zero-sum framework for geopolitics becomes not just inevitable, but more salient, right? We all get obsessed about Pelosi going to Taiwan kind of thing. More salient when the key players in the competition are themselves managing tenuous, extremely unequal political regimes, right? So adapting to climate change, managing resource shortages, recovering from the pandemic, these are rightly priorities of most Asian governments right now. And these things are not just objects of cooperation and trust building, although they are that, but also these are things that if you don't attend to them, they'll exacerbate inequality, threaten social cohesion further, and then therefore threaten regime security. So I need to stop talking, but if there's a flashpoint in Asia that does not get enough attention, but intersects with this larger problematique that I'm putting out there, it's the crisis of debt sustainability across most of what we would call the Indo-Pacific now, right? It's something OECD countries are culpable in and something they can help remedy. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks, Van. What you seem to be saying is that one of the sources of geopolitical tension is, in fact, the rot in the systems of the competing countries brought about by domestic inequality and structural problems that are being shoved aside and given less attention because it's easier to focus on international issues. So we'll come back to that and love to have you elaborate. Professor Sunami, over to you, please.
Hi. Thank you. Thank you very much. Actually, I'm joining tonight from Ankara, Turkey.
Oh, still 4 time zones.
Yeah, so, but still here in the locally, I'm part of the Asia region in Turkey. So I guess it'll be appropriate to talk about Asia and trust building. But, you know, I have to echo the what the Kristi and Van mentioned. Particularly Kristi has talked about the emergence of China. And as we work in the Asia, particularly from Japan side, the issues that are rising now as with the emergence of China, the area of economic security, economic coercion, all these things are very making it a very new sort of a discussion, geopolitical argument in the area that we have not really discussed or seen before. And if I may want to add one more area where I've been personally working a lot is science and technology or emergence technology area, where we see in this area that the rise of this tension, the geopolitical rivalry between China and the rest is really seeing a quite intense, and how to manage this geopolitical rivalry in the emerging technologies like AI, robotics, even, you know, when we coming out of the pandemic, when I was conducting this sort of science, so-called what we call science diplomacy area, where we thought that in a positive note, that finally the people that are working in the life science or the immunology or any other the development of you know vaccines and things, that now they find it that it was very important to collaborate globally, because this is a global challenge that the scientists faced. So all the scientists are ready to collaborate for the first time, not competing for the best papers or, you know, getting all the awards and so on and so forth, or finding the first discovery of the way to, you know, produce this new vaccine or whatever. But now they're willing to cooperate across all over the world, where, you know, to develop this the common cure for this common challenge. But then, you know, as Senator Wu was mentioning, that we see more competition in this area, where we have a national strategies of vaccines, or the national, sort of the vaccine diplomacy, that are making a very, this supposed to be a common issue, where common challenges are faced by the or the scientific community would be willing to you know, provide the answer to. And so in even the area of emerging technology or new area of science, we are unfortunately seeing a geopolitical challenge that are taking place. And even with Russia's invasion in Ukraine, making it that all the scientific cooperation with Russia is even making it harder. Now Russia is coming out, you know, putting out of the space. Russia is now talking about, you know, how we're going to collaborate the climate change in the Arctic region, you know, that sort of thing. I mean, Russia is a chair of the Arctic Council, and where we need to collaborate to solve the problem of the Arctic, where we have a geopolitical challenge that are really coming into. So this is another area that we are seeing the problem of geopolitical tension.
Yes, thank you for that. Let's have a bit of a discussion on the three of you, the answers from the three of you, and please feel free to jump in. Maybe I can start with you, Professor Sunami. You know, you talk about technological nationalism, techno-nationalism, you want to call it, getting in the way of scientific and technological cooperation. But isn't that kind of the point of a lot of, say, American policy to in fact decouple and to not allow, say, China to get access to certain technologies for fear of being surpassed in areas of technological importance, such as semiconductors, of course, but also biomedical sciences and AI. Isn't that precisely what the policy is? And is that something you support?
Well, we have been seeing that the essence of the innovation used to be open. And so open innovation is the fastest and more effective way to have the innovation globally. But now it's the question of who you work with. And when we talk about open, but then we also have to have a more precise strategy of closed, and who you want to disclose, who you want to protect from. And now the new trend in this area, as you mentioned, Senator, that of course, semiconductor strategy coming out of the U.S. and Japan, of course, is reaching out to Taiwan and having more strategizing this global supply chain in critical technologies. And this is going to be a current trend of many countries in us. And but this is something is very important that we should really take a serious look at, I think. Or how do we, because today's topic is talking about trust. And, if you go down this road to area where you're talking about even strategizing who you work with and so on and so forth in this area, we need to find a way to also, what would be the condition then we find a way to collaborate. And this is also something it's very important at the same time to talk about, right?
Yes. I mean, it seems to me that the very policies you described work against trust building, and they probably exacerbate the level of mistrust and distrust, even in areas where we can all agree that cooperation is the best way forward. Van, if I can come to you and pick up on some of your comments about domestic inequality and structural challenges in the United States on the one hand, and in China on the other hand, as kind of the drivers of geopolitical conflict. I don't see those challenges in China or the United States going away overnight. These are truly structural problems that are not going to be solved in a jiffy. Are we therefore doomed to see an acceleration and deepening and heightening of this geopolitical tension between the US and China precisely because of their domestic difficulties?
I mean, the prognosis is not good, man. We're in a terrible direction, as you just suggested a minute ago. Like tech trends is a harbinger of things to come, it seems like. But inevitability is maybe like a bit too far, because it really depends on what we do with economic statecraft. If we are consumed by a sort of nationalist, military Keynesian political economy model, then we're going to fuel the trends that create the world that we hate and fear, right? But if we use economic statecraft instead to address and target the conditions that give rise to that, then over time we can attenuate the power, the acuteness of this like rivalry process, maybe before it slips into like a disaster, and what that means practically is putting economic leverage, resources, brain power, like an actual economic statecraft, which we totally lack right now in the US, putting it to work to reduce Asia's billion-person precariat of workers, which includes in China. And that is going to involve a lot of policies that that exist in our imagination. There's a playbook for it, but that we're not used to advocating for, we're not used to mobilizing state power and campaigns for, right? The global minimum tax is one little drop of goodness in the ocean of what needs to happen. But it's like moves like that, once you can start stacking them on each other, you can start to create a world that doesn't suck so much. So like, are we inevitably going to succumb to this like tragedy of great power politics? Well, no, it depends on what we do, right? It's just that right now, the framework that we're operating within is going in that tragedy of great power politics direction.
Right. Well, let me pass the baton of economic statecraft to Kristi, who believes that hot economics, cold politics is passé. Is that really true, Kristi? And can we not revive some sense of mutual benefit from the liberalization and freer trade and open borders across ideological lines? The so-called APEC vision that we had a good run on for a couple of decades. If we don't have any of that, I mean, if truly we are in a world where it's all about calculating who your friends are and only doing business with them, how much room is there for the kind of economic statecraft that Van's talking about?
So I wouldn't say that hot economics and cold politics is dead in the sense that, those dynamics don't exist. But I think what people don't really hold on to anymore is this idea that you can build a clear firewall between economics and politics, and that's going to just be totally separate. And I think that's because of both concrete linkages between like certain kinds of technology and security. It's because countries are using economic statecraft either in a positive sense or in a punitive sense. And I really appreciated Van's comments about, economic statecraft being used for positive things, and because that's often something that people don't think of. They think about economic coercion, et cetera. But so I think that that's the sense in which I mean that, these linkages are just much more complex. Is there a lot of interdependence? Yes. Is there still a lot of economic wealth being generated in the region? Yes. Is it being, evenly distributed? No. So I think there are all of these, dynamics still happening, and there's a lot of potential. And you asked me, I think, after my initial comments, whether I thought that countries were willing to sacrifice economic ties, for political concerns. And I don't think that's the case uniformly, and I don't think any country would say yes overall. But I think there's a lot more concern, and there's a lot more thoughtfulness about how this is done, and a lot more awareness of possible dangers. And I think, again, you asked me whether, the rise of China necessitated this. And I would point out that the rise of China was a great boon to many countries in the region. Many countries became very interdependent, benefited economically. Their economies grew as China's economy grew. All of this is, very true. It's just that, for the last 10 years or so, China has become more assertive in its behavior, and it has shown a willingness to, pull on those economic ties and use them for various purposes. So I think that, again, it's not that hot economics part doesn't exist. It's just that that firewall, I think, is increasingly in doubt. And I think countries are thinking much more carefully about, their own choices, and also how this equates, both in the short term and the long term.
That's great. Before we get to possible remedies and solutions, let's do another round to look at some maybe sub-regional issues, and invite each of you to talk a bit about hotspots or areas of particular concern that may not directly emanate from US-China competition, because we all know that there are other kinds of conflicts in the region, long simmering historical conflicts, Korea-Japan, of course, within Southeast Asia, Greater China, needless to say, and of course, China and India. Mr. Sunami, would you like to start and talk a bit about, say, the Korea-Japan relationship and how you see that playing out as a potential source of mistrust and growing mistrust that could affect the region?
Yeah, I mean, that's of course, I have studied in Korea in my life, and I have a lot of friends and my colleagues in Korea, and the Korea-Japan relations are something that I can go on for weeks talking about, and it has been one of my passions. Of course, that would include North Korea and in some area, let's say in Russia, for instance, in Northeast Asia. But let me also talking about the hotspot, I think ASEAN is a very important area that because we work very closely in the peace mediation efforts, for instance, in South Thai or Myanmar, and these are very, very important areas in Asia where we need to come up with a very, somehow the solution very quickly. And this is nowhere, we shouldn't really getting into this geopolitical rivalry. I mean, this is Asia's problem, and Asia need to come up with the Asian solution. And yet we are, one of the reasons why I'm in Turkey, of course, is another, all these dialogues of we are trying as a foundation to have the Muslim Asia community to see how we can work on these ethnic minority conflicts in those, ASEAN countries, or can ASEAN as a united, produce some kind of Asian solution to all these things. I mean, these are the very important topic and hot topic that are being affected by the Russian invasion of Ukraine or the rise of China, the competition between US and China, all this. And Asia's problem is now even harder to come up with the Asian solution. And I think this is an area that if you mention the hotspots, of course, Taiwan Straits or any other area, but I think we should also not to forget there's no outcome on the Myanmar, for instance. This is a very important area.
Yes.
Yes.
I'm really happy you mentioned ASEAN. It's unfortunate we don't have a speaker from ASEAN as such, but I'm wondering if Van might be able to say something about it, particularly the idea of ASEAN centrality and an ASEAN approach to great power competition that they would like to tout as somewhat different from maybe the way all of you have portrayed it, certainly different from the way Japan and Korea would characterize it. We know that ASEAN has an Indo-Pacific strategy that is really about trade and economics mostly. And we know that the ASEAN countries have been generally reticent, certainly not full-throated in their condemnation of Russia on the Ukraine issue. Does ASEAN have anything to point us to in terms of managing the degree of distrust in the region? Van?
Yeah, I mean, so the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies in Malaysia, they come out with this like regular polling of Southeast Asian societies and Southeast Asian policy elites. And it was either late 2020 or early 2021, they had polling asking about, what are your greatest priorities in foreign policy? And, what are their biggest threats or fears? And top of their list was economic development, recovery from the pandemic, adaptation to climate change, right? Economic inequality reduction. These are the statements of what their priorities were. And then their biggest fear was becoming caught up as pawns in great power competition. And so like, if you're looking at what Southeast Asians prioritize, and by the way, the Pacific Island region has all of those exact same priorities. Like the architecture of the Pacific Islands is kind of ASEAN-like. It's its own thing, but the logic is very similar to ASEAN. The problems are very similar to ASEAN. And so like, if you take as a starting point, what is it that Southeast Asia and the ASEAN governments care about and are worried about? That is a focal point for cooperation. That is also the inversion of what America's priorities toward the Indo-Pacific are, right? We've started massaging our talking points a little bit. So when somebody like Tony Blinken goes out to the region, well, of course, or Kurt Campbell, like they're going to say something along the lines of like, well, we're donating, X number of vaccines to such and such country. But like that's not what the priority is. That's not what the thrust of our energy is. That's not what the primary allocation of resources is focused on at all. We all know it's all military, right? Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. It's not, I don't want to say it's fake, but it's not substantive, that's for sure. You know, it's not game changing. And so if we started with what ASEAN's cared about, we would be able to sidestep or like approach the region orthogonally to the rivalry stuff. And that would actually be like a net good. Like that would generate a more positive valence for the region.
Right. I'm glad you brought up the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. I recall the Indonesian foreign minister talking about how after Blinken arrived with his offer of the IPEF, said that it was like being offered a meal during Ramadan. Not much good. Let's pivot a bit to solutions, and I want to start with Kristi to talk about what might be some helpful mechanisms, including perhaps the IPF. I don't know, maybe you have a different view of the IPF, because I know you've written an IPF and it has the potential to evolve. It could become something meaningful. There could be some market access measures incorporated in the future, who knows? But can we talk about the utility, the benefit, or disbenefit of some of the current minilateral and trade-related initiatives that are being proposed, typically from the West, to try and you can either call it shore up the allies or restore trust to the contain China, your choice of words. But I'm thinking about IPEF, I'm thinking about the Quad, I'm thinking about AUKUS, and how do you see them in relation to the status quo fora that already exist and have a lot of pedigree in Asia, you know, the East Asia Summit, of course, APEC, ASEAN Regional Forum, and on it goes. Kristi, would you like to start off?
Sure, that's definitely a very big question, but I'll add some thoughts to start and others can weigh in. So yeah, I've done a lot of work on Asian regional institutions, and it's interesting how now, you know, the explicit strategy of the Biden administration is to, you know, basically not let the forum set the agenda, but let the agenda set the forum. And they have this whole idea about pursuing, you know, small groupings of like-minded countries who can work together on specific issues. And so we see this trend towards minilateralism, but especially mini-lateralism, so very small groups of, like, say, 4 in the Quad or 3 in AUKUS, et cetera. And I think it's interesting just to tie it back to our conversations about, you know, trust. I think there's an interesting dynamic there, because the idea is that you are bringing together a small number of like-minded countries with the idea that you can push forward more productively than in a more inclusive grouping like the East Asia Summit or APEC, because you have this sort of, you know, closer consonance of interest. But, you know, in fact, there is a lot of variation in the like-mindedness of those countries. Like in the Quad, we see India, you know, who is come a far distance towards, you know, agreeing on more things, but still there's, even the like-mindeds are not that, you know, always that like-minded. So I think there's trust building within those groups, which can be useful. But then I think the overall dynamic is that you have small groupings of countries talking to one another, you know, who agree on issues, and then they're not really talking in the broader forums that are more inclusive and that include the countries that they probably most need to build trust with and have those broader dialogues. So I think that it's an interesting, you know, tactic. And then if we talk about, you know, trade or other groupings too, the question is, how do these small groupings link up with larger groupings? Are they going to be harmonizable? So, and the IPEF, as has been mentioned, is, you know, sort of yet to be determined in terms of content, but how exactly does it relate to, you know, other trade agreements? We know there's not going to be, you know, market access in it, but, you know, will it link up with other bilateral or things that are on the table elsewhere? You know, will there be a pathway for that, or will it just be an isolated mechanism? You know, so basically the question, you know, besides the question of trust that we're discussing is, you know, do these small steps, you know, equate to overall cooperation and effectiveness, or are they more of a distraction or a duplication? I mean, inherently, there's nothing wrong with doing this, but there are questions. The jury's still out on where it all goes to in the end, I would say.
Yeah, and the centrality of economics in these agreements, and whether or not, to go back to your original thesis, I know it's not a strong thesis, but, you know, the weak thesis that economics is playing a lesser role than it used to play in the calculations of Asian countries in their strategic calculations. If it's really playing a much lesser role, then maybe market access is not as important. That's not what I'm hearing from ASEAN interlocutors. Van, your thoughts on the utility benefit, disbenefit of pick your pick, Quad, AUKUS, IPF, for building trust in the region?
Yeah, I mean, so the traditional regional institution or the traditional architecture, like APEC, EAS, et cetera,
yeah,
they've existed. They've existed to prevent fiscal crises, maybe certainly to support export-oriented growth strategies. My beef with them is that they have facilitated this like extreme inegalitarianism that has created political instability. So like maybe if these regional institutions didn't forsake workers and labor rights, then they would be like more sustainable and more delivering on like a public good kind of thing. But the past is the past. Those kinds of purposes that we would maybe like frame as neoliberal, that's fine as far as it goes, because it was the unipolar moment, right? Under conditions of American hegemony, maybe the political economy that the old regional institutions were producing, maybe it wasn't totally fair, but it certainly made sense. And it was doing more good than the status quo was, but we haven't been under conditions of American hegemony for like, I don't know, at least a decade, and then when you look at the new mini-lateral groupings, which frankly, I hate that term, insofar as the mini-lateral networks provide public goods, they're beneficial to Asian security. But my concern is that like the mini-laterals fall into one of two buckets, right? One kind of mini-lateralism perpetuates the same old formula for political economy that gives us geopolitical volatility. And then the other kind of mini-lateralism is entirely about rivalry, and it generates what I would call like an antagonistic trust, right? So where like-minded states are coming together, but in a way that polarizes others further apart. So it's a content versus form question. The form of these arrangements is what we often talk about. The content is what's really going to be decisive, right? Like-minded nations coming together to do what and why. What's the effect of on regional cohesion, right? Well, that depends. But it doesn't look good, because when you look at things like AUKUS, the Quad seems to be sensitive to its branding issue and is trying to portray itself as a public goods provider. But I think we all recognize a kind of subtext there, So a lot of the mini-laterals are generating an antagonistic kind of trust, which again puts us on like the wrong side of certain trends.
Thank you. Atsushi, over to you.
Yes. In a way, I'm trying to probably echo some of the Van mentioned about this. Either you're actually generating more distrust than creating the multilateral kind of framework. I mean, the IPEF from the beginning, I think the Japanese, my colleagues are also equal to the US colleagues that you have to provide something. The concept is one thing, but what's in it for Asia, right? I mean, we talk about the trust in Asia, but we have to tell the U.S. that the U.S. should gain trust in Asia also at the same time. And can IPEF be the one that will actually that will gain the trust from ASEANs or other Asian countries? For the U.S. is one issue, and I think it's a great opportunity for U.S. to really step up and market access and other things that are going to be very important for it. And I think the Quad, yes, AUKUS, of course, it's more technology and the security, but these are more of who you can work with in very sensitive and more security-based area that are dividing most of the Asian, communities in a way of, so this is I guess that's what most of the Van was mentioning about this. But then, but we're in talking about solution though. But I think one area which in talking about multilateralism or building trust in Asia is the framework for education for young generation, where I worked on maybe 10 years ago or something with the Japanese government on proposing the idea of Campus Asia, which is sort of the Asian version of Erasmus education system of the Europe, where we could have the Japanese or Asian universities can freely talk about interchanging of credits or degrees and so on and so forth, so that the young Asian students would have at least multiple experiences of studying at different Asian countries and graduate from that system. And these are sort of things that we need to be investing now for the future of Asia. We're talking about geopolitical competitions and all that. Oh yes, that's happening. But then for the young generation, where this sort of, are we educating in a way? I mean, you mentioned, the Senator, about the Korea-Japan problem, right? It's really about the young generation coming up with how Korea-Japan can work together, right? We always talking about whether we understand the history or I mean, these are very important issues. But, at the end of the day, we are trusting the next generation of Koreans and Japanese and Chinese and Asians, right? Would they come up with some kind of positive trust building kind of mechanism? I mean, and so that's where we need to be investing more on. It's a kind of education system. And that's, I think we are looking at the great opportunity, because now we have Asian universities, ASEAN countries or China, Korea, and others. It's I mean, they're developing even fast than in making global. So I think it is something that we should be also talking about, the multilateral framework in education system.
That's a great point. I like to bookmark it because it connects very nicely with a previous session at which our former Governor General David Johnson talked about Canada as a knowledge diplomat, or the power of knowledge diplomacy, and how Canada should emphasize knowledge diplomacy as one of its core contributions to trust building. I think it connects very nicely with what you're saying. But I will tell you that there's a mood in this country that is increasingly suspicious about Chinese students coming here and studying in the STEM fields. So we have cross currents in our own country that mitigate against people-to-people exchanges in education and the kind of trust building for the younger generation that could be beneficial. That brings to mind the Obama idea. You remember, Kristi, some years ago, was it send 100,000 people, young people, to China every year, or over 5 years? Has that been scrapped entirely, or is it still happening? Because if it's happening, that's a very positive sign of trust building. Do you know, or maybe Van?
I don't know specifically, but it's become very difficult to enter China for most people.
Of course, for COVID,
in this period. So I'm guessing that,
likely.
Even if they had meant to continue it, I think it would have encountered difficulties. And I think that's a good point about how these ties are, breaking down and fragmenting. I'd also just quickly make one point that I think, these comments about education and economic inequality and having to address these really long-term fundamental problems are really spot on. And I think it really points out the disjuncture with trying to kind of pursue a whack-a-mole strategy of, combating the geopolitical problems of today versus investing in a more long-term strategy where you really are trying to shape the, long-term environment. But I think that, again, is, difficult for countries like the United States to focus on these long-term challenges and really have a consistent policy. So I think that's a challenge.
I'm going to turn to the audience in a minute for questions, and just to prepare the organizers for queuing them up. I think we're going to hear them live or perhaps I'll get a note on chat for the online questions. But as the audience prepares to step up to the microphone, let me just ask each of you quickly for some advice for Canada, because our country is now in the midst of coming up with its own Indo-Pacific strategy. It's been long delayed. There's an expert group that's been set up to provide some ideas to the government for the establishment of this policy. Let me ask each of you, what would a trust building Indo-Pacific strategy for Canada, what would it look like? Give me one or two elements that it should contain, as opposed to be trust negating, if you know what I mean. Atsushi, would you like to start? Some free advice for Canada, please.
That's a very tough question. Actually, I myself did boarding for 5 years in Toronto, since many years ago. And, one of the things about Canada is where you could really, as I mentioned, can we Asians can have an Asian solution to the future of either trust or whatever. And Canada may have way to provide, help Asians to come up with Asian solutions in a way, because it's all about inclusiveness, right? I mean, we're talking about Muslim Islamic communities in Asia. I mean, you look at on the one hand, it's Afghanistan, and then on the other, a country like Indonesia, the big, Islamic communities, and the interpretation of, for instance, Sharia, for instance, and the Islamic law is so diverse, and this kind of the way to find the kind of inclusive model, Canada has been leading with the country where you are trying to find the balance in the kind of way to create this, and I think this knowledge diplomacy, I guess that the Senator mentioned, that the way to direct this and to find the way of how to find this kind of inclusive model in Asia, where we could all sort of find a way to coexist, is a very important, and the Canadian universities, academics, or Canadian diplomacy can facilitate in this developing this model, I think.
That's a very helpful suggestion. Thank you for that. I'll make sure it's conveyed. Van.
Yeah, I mean, the most important thing in terms of being both responsible and strategic is to center the Asian people, right?
Yes.
And what does that cash out as? What does that look like? Well, I think a good place to start would be those, ASEAN priorities,
centrality,
right?
yeah.
Yeah, and like these issues that are there, the whole region is facing a debt sustainability crisis right now. Cambodia, Laos, Philippines, Myanmar, all debt distressed. 10 Pacific Island nations, moderate to high risk of debt default. This will transform geopolitics in Asia. Nobody's really doing anything about it, but partially it's because you can't do anything about it within a framework of strategic rivalry. You've got to come at Asia, the Indo-Pacific, from a different angle. And what does trust building look like? Well, start with ASEAN priorities,
Okay, super. Kristi?
I would echo the comments of my fellow panelists on inclusivity and, paying attention to the demands from the region. I would also say that consideration of short versus long-term, interests and strategies is important in thinking about, what benefits Canada in the short term and what Canada can do in the short term, but also in the long term, what Indo-Pacific region would Canada like to see, and what would its place be there, and to try to, do what we're saying and have more of that vision. I think also there's a balance to be had between, opportunities, because of course, Canada strategically has to keep an eye on where it could possibly benefit from interlinkages with the Indo-Pacific, but also where it could use its resources or knowledge or other things to help the region and to really, give and take. And of course, a sensitivity to, Canada's unique role in the region, just as every country with an Indo-Pacific strategy sort of has to navigate that. We've seen European countries come up with their own European strategies or Indo-Pacific strategies, who are much further away, but some of whom, like France, have direct, territorial interests in the region. So I think every country has to grapple with that kind of identity component of it as well, and think about the audience in the region as well as its own interests.
Right, but all of you are saying put Asian countries at the center of any Indo-Pacific strategy and figure out what their needs are, rather than treating it simply as a tool of strategic rivalry. That certainly is Van's point. Well, let's turn to some questions and comments from the audience. If you would please introduce yourself and keep your questions relatively brief.
My name is Alsu. I'm a visiting scholar from Simon Fraser University, Department of History. And my question is basically related to the trust building issues and the trust building measures. As many of you may remember, one of the prominent instances when the United States and China had a significant amount of trust, one of the issues used to be war on terrorism. It was one of those things that when Russia, the United States, and China were ready to hold hands and sing Kumbaya, right? We had the United States basically ended up in an Iraq war. Russia had 2 Chechen wars. China is struggling with Xinjiang issue right now. So I'm wondering, in our attempt to build trust, what kind of issues and what kind of consequences should we be wary about? Because it seems that one of those, when we are searching for common issues to solve together in order to build better trust between these countries, we might end up creating an even bigger mess. Would you agree? And to what extent? And what are the potential risks? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So unintended consequences of working on common issues. If each of you could just quickly comment and give an example of an area that you think is relatively benign and safe and which we should foster cooperation in. Kristi, would you like to start? Would you agree with the statement from the questioner that the so-called cooperation in the war on terrorism was a disaster certainly for Iraq and for Chechnya and for Xinjiang?
Well, I think the cooperation on terrorism is particularly problematic because terrorism was equated with like separatism in authoritarian countries and was basically that discourse was used to put down people within their own country that they, wanted to constrain for various reasons. So I think that's a particularly problematic example. I think you always have to be aware. I think, for people who are really committed to human rights, I think it's been very satisfying to see those critiques come to the forefront of policy these days, as they had often been quite muted in the past in the name of, broader geopolitical aims. So I take the speaker's point. I do think, there are probably ways in which you could try to facilitate. I guess climate change is always the one that people say. Of course, there are also problematic ways to collaborate on climate. So I'm sure there's a way to mess that up if you really don't pay attention to it in terms of, how you structure incentives or how you go forward. But I think that there are less problematic examples than the one that the speaker gave, which was quite troublesome.
Okay, climate for sure. I'm sure somebody's going to say health. Do you, Van or Atsushi, have other areas? Education, I think, is Atsushi might mention, but Van, anything else to add to the menu of options?
Yeah, I would just say the whole war on terror disaster, that's the perfect example of this antagonistic trust problem, right? You claim you're building a kind of trust, right? In the war on terror days, it was the collaboration with China on this issue was an alternative to opting into great power competition, which the Bush administration had wanted to do initially, right? But it's the kind of trust that polarizes others further apart. It pitted states against their societies, right? It caused violence. We were on the wrong side of Xinjiang, for God's sake, and so what's on the positive side of the ledger that doesn't generate antagonistic trust? That's the question. And I think one of the things that would be useful there is a kind of campaign of debt relief and debt restructuring, because we're facing a ticking time bomb.
Atsushi?
Yes. Of course, I've been saying education, and one of
Yes.
the things that we are working on is de-radicalization.
Radicalization, yes.
Yes, of the youth. And this goes to not only for one particular side of the side, but it goes to everyone. I think all the young generation needs to have the economic opportunities or other ways that they can, instead of going to radicalize and being, on that side, we should provide a way to really find a new way of living, hope. And de-radicalization education is something that Canada also can contribute to any parts of this sort of vision, because it doesn't belong to one particular side of religion, but other ethnic groups and others. But de-radicalization for young generation is something I think it's very important for us.
Thank you for that. Maybe have another question from the audience.
Yes, on the right-hand side of the room. Go ahead.
Oh, thank you. So my name is Trisha Rankin-Sebastian, and I'm a Master's of Community Development graduate student here. And my ancestors are from the Philippines, specifically the Luzon province. And my parents moved to the United States before I was born. And when I was growing up, there was the People Powers Revolution in the Philippines, where they were able to overthrow an authoritarian dictator regime. But the promise of that kind of faltered in the intervening years, and the rise of populism is once again raising its head with the election of Marcos's son.
Marcos.
And so I guess my question is, how do we combat the rise of adherence to populist leaders in Asia, because there was so much of an emphasis on great person politics there?
Who would like to take that question?
Can I just offer quickly?
Yeah.
This is exactly why my diagnosis of Asia and my opening comments matters, right? The ethno-nationalism is the Asian equivalent. The populism is the equivalent of given the poor white man Jim Crow, right? It's the Filipino workers who are disenfranchised under a system of like rank kleptocracy, who then look to populists, right? So if you want to solve that problem, you have to grasp the problem by the root, and that really is addressing economic insecurity.
Right, which is not a problem that's unique to developing countries in Asia.
That's right.
It's also rampant in Western Europe and of course
US.
North America. Yeah, exactly. Next question, please.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you very much. It's Jeff Nankervell here, CEO of the Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada. Proud to be associated with this session, and I'd like to give a shout out to our Vice President, Research and Strategy, Jeff Reeves, who brought together the panel for this event. And you've been superb, all four of you. It's been very, very engaging. My question is, we've talked a lot about sort of foreign policy actors, governments, government strategies, government policies, but life is a lot more than governments. And I'm wondering what role the panelists see for the corporate sector to play in all of this. Is it possible that the corporate sector in various ways, in various parts of the region, acts as a bit of a counterweight to some of these trends? Because I think we've seen, and we'll have some roundtable discussions later in the day today, about how the people who make financial investment and trade decisions in the corporate world are not necessarily going in the same direction and at the same speed as policymakers in Washington and Tokyo and Beijing and other places.
Kristi, could I ask you to kick off, and I just preface your intervention by commenting that we hear a lot less from, the American Chamber of Commerce in China, or the US-China Business Council, in terms of trying to mitigate what might be considered the more draconian trade actions against China. Is that part of the answer to Jeff's question, that they are either unwilling or unable to mitigate?
So this is a really important and complex question that I cannot answer in the 5 minutes that we have remaining to this panel. But I would just say that, so certainly business has their own views and their own calculations about what benefits them and what makes sense for their strategies in Asia. Over time, we have seen that businesses have increasingly found it wise to diversify their interests in the region for various reasons. And so there are still a lot of reasons that China, for example, is a very attractive market, and many companies are very highly invested there. I think that a big part of the question is sort of pointing this disjuncture out between government policy and company behavior. And I think it's very interesting to note that so many of the government policies that are out there today about supply chain resilience and economic security, in fact, require the cooperation of the private sector in a very concerted way that is not clear that is going to be possible or amenable to. So I think that that's one of the things that has to be discussed. But then also, I think it's just as a final point, I mean, I think there's that disjuncture and that need for public-private dialogue, but it's also true that, companies have their own calculations to make, and that means in some cases that they want to invest in these places, but it's increasingly difficult for them to hold those positions and advocate for them very strongly because of the geopolitical context. So you don't hear this kind of vocal support of stronger ties. Instead, it's still there, but it's a lot quieter. And you also hear statements from government officials about not wanting to go in and bail out companies who made risky decisions, and these kinds of things. So I think there's, a growing political sensitivity to that, even if the economic incentives still seem very right for the same kinds of investment decisions that companies have been making. So yeah, I think it's important and complex and increasingly political.
Atsushi, what is Japan Inc. thinking about strategic rivalry and?
Well, the role of private sector is increasingly important. And I think we have a lot of seeing some of the impact of ESG investment that are taking place globally. To some of the major corporations that are more aware of sensitivity of human rights or, SDGs goals and so on and so forth as their business models. We are now, I think, and also convening a meeting, I think, in a couple of months, I think, in Tokyo, that to invite the Asian corporate foundations that are growing in a large to talk about what would be the role of a civil society in the private sector that are really coming up with these Asian corporations that are establishing foundations to spearhead some of the social issues. And these are new actors that are emerging within Asia, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thai, for instance. And I think we should be paying more attention to some of them that have some more impact on some of the issues that we're talking about, both education, trust building, and climate or other social issues. So I think the question is right, and I think we are ready to really should spend more strategizing in this sector as well.
Van, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean the cross section of the Indo-Pacific that is also part of the global South, like emerging economies, if you will.
Yeah.
They're thirsty for development capital and foreign investment. And I would wager that, like, dollar for dollar, private investment capital is going to be more valuable and more useful than government foreign assistance, right? Aid, like grants and aid and that kind of thing. And it's just a matter of allocating capital toward these countries that need it. And if we can get that happening, we're going to generate virtuous cycles of new demand, right, for consumption, for production. And so there's a public-private collaboration that's possible here, where the object is to try and divert capital toward emerging economies in Asia, and that's still to be happened. It hasn't happened yet.
You're talking about domestic capitalists, though, you know, the Kadins of the world and the chambers of commerce in Malaysia and Philippines and so on, as opposed to American or Canadian or Japanese business interests. Is that correct?
Well, OECD nations in general have a lot of surplus capital that they could be allocating toward emerging economies in Asia. And their governments could, these same governments could be incentivizing it, creating I don't know, subsidies or offsets or something that encourages it, because that is one way of shoring up regional precarity, frankly.
Right. Recycling surpluses.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we're at 12:35, and I'm going to turn it back to the organizers. But before I do that, can I please express my deep appreciation to all the panelists, to the organizers, and to the audience for a terrific session and for your patience.
Thank you, Senator Paul Wu, and of course, our three panelists, wherever you are in the world, for this really important and engaging and enlightening discussion. Thank you on behalf of everybody here at the Victoria Forum, both in person and those of us online.